we're going to make Devil's Food Cake. So this is a high fat, high sugar cake. So it could be considered a high ratio cake. This one's relatively simple in that we're just going to whisk everything together. So the first thing we want to do is we want to sift our dry ingredients. So we've got the flour, the cocoa powder, I've got the salt and the baking soda. And I just want to get them all through the sifter, and I'm going to sift it right into the KitchenAid. You can easily mix this recipe by hand. It's a small enough recipe, it's easy to do by hand. We just want to push through any of the chunks that are left. And the big bits that don't go through, don't send them through. Okay, so we've got our dry ingredients all sifted. I'm going to pop that onto the KitchenAid just to get it out of my way. And I'm going to use the paddle in the machine. But if you're doing this by hand, you could use a whisk. And the next thing we want to do is we want to whisk our wet ingredients together. So I have sugar here, and people are always questioning why sugar is considered a wet ingredient. It's because when you add it to liquid, it dissolves. So it's considered a wet ingredient in this scenario. So we're going to take our eggs. And I like to start with eggs and half the sugar, just to make sure that I get everything broken up. So I'm going to add those two. And I'm just going to whisk it. Just make sure my eggs are nice and broken up. Good. I'm going to add the rest of the sugar. Then I'm going to add my buttermilk. If you don't have buttermilk, an easy solution is to take about 20 grams of lemon juice or vinegar for every 250 grams of milk that you have. And if you put those together, it'll work the same as buttermilk. Buttermilk is just really, really acidic, and we need that to do part of the leavening. So baking soda is activated by acid. So we're using the buttermilk as an acid to help leaven the cake. Got that mixed in, and then we're going to add our oil and our vanilla. I just put mine together. We're going to whisk that together. So now all of our liquid ingredients are whisked together and all of our dry ingredients are sifted. The last thing we want to do is make sure that our cake pans are ready to go before we put these two together. So when baking soda hits the acid of the buttermilk, it's going to start to create bubbles right away, which means that we don't really want this cake mix to sit around. Once we have it mixed, we want to make sure it goes into the oven as soon as possible. So we need to get our pans ready. And so to do that, depending on what kind of pan you have, I'm using cake rings today. To prepare a cake ring, this is usually used for mousse cakes and that sort of thing, but I'm going to use it to bake sponge in. Now, if your sponge is thick enough, you don't have to worry about this part, but I'm not sure that our sponge is thick enough, and I don't want it to flood out the bottom, so we're going to make a little bottom for it to make sure that when I pour the cake mix in here, it doesn't go running out of the bottom. So to do that, I have a piece of tin foil and just a square of parchment, and it's not big, but I'm just going to pop it on top and make sure that it's lined up nice and center with the ring. And then I'm just going to start rolling the tin foil from the side. And when I get up to the tin, I'm going to pinch it between my thumb and my finger, and then I'm just going to proceed to roll the tin foil all the way around, putting pressure on the ring. Turn it a little bit and do the same. And there, now I have a bit of a guaranteed bottom that I know that my cake mix isn't going to run out of. Also, as a little extra insurance, I'm just going to give a quick pan spray around the sides, just to make sure when I go to release my cake later, it comes out without ripping. So cake pans are ready, so let's make our cake mix. Pull that a little bit closer. So I just want to start making sure that my sifted ingredients are well blended because I don't want to overmix this cake. So I'm going to pour in my liquid ingredients and then mix it just until it comes together. So once that's a little bit started, which it is, I'm just going to pour this down the side. And I'm going to pour fairly quickly. There's no point in pouring really slowly. I'm going to turn that up maybe to speed 2 for 1 second. And now I know the dry ingredients are sort of stuck to the bottom. So I'm going to take my spatula and really scrape just to make sure everything's coming together okay. Really pay attention to that little bubble on the bottom of the KitchenAid bowl. Give it another 30 seconds or so. I'm going to scrape it one more time. Really just make sure that there's no lumps, no dry bits of flour hanging around. Maybe another 30 seconds and we're done. So you can see how easily this would have mixed by hand. Didn't take very much effort from the KitchenAid. Just before I take the paddle out, I'm going to do one more quick stir just to make sure I don't have any lumps or bumps or things hanging around. Looks good. Scrape off my paddle really well. That looks good. Now the last thing we want to do is make sure that we're scaling this properly and that both of our cakes are going to end up exactly the same. So typically in a restaurant or a bakery setting, you're probably not making 2 cakes, you're probably going to make 20 or 30. So the scale is really important to make sure that they're all coming out the same size. So I like to pop it on my scale. You don't want to lift these separately onto the scale, you want the whole tray. But because of that, I'm going to move them to the front so that the tray's a little bit more even in weight and it doesn't tip off the back. I'm going to turn my scale on and I'm going to scale both of these at about 500 grams. I'm just going to start by pouring. So there's 500 in that one. Okay, and I have 500 in that one, and this is what I have left in the bowl. So I'm just going to divide it equally between the two. So I'm going to start with 25 grams extra in each. Give my bowl a good scrape just to make sure I'm getting it all. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to stick these in the oven. They're probably going to take about 30 minutes, but it'll really depend on which oven you're using. Once they're baked, I'm going to sort of gently press with the middle of the cake with my finger. If it leaves an indent and it feels wet and you can feel the bubbles crush, it's not quite done yet. If when you touch it, it feels a little bit spongy, like it's bouncing back a little, you're going to use your thermometer to poke it and pull it out and look for any wet batter left on the stick. If it comes out with some wet crumbs on it, it's okay. If you poke it and it comes out slimy, it's not done yet, so let it go a little bit longer. Don't start poking until you do the touch test, because if you can touch it until it's raw, there's no point in poking 16 holes into the center of your cake. It's only as a last test. So you want to touch with your finger first, gently in the middle, Don't touch around the outsides because the middle is the last spot to bake. So touch in the middle. If it bounces back, then you're going to do the pick test. All right, so about 30 minutes. I would start your timer for about 25 and start checking every 5 minutes after that. So our cakes have just come out of the oven, and you can see that they are nice and baked, and that when I push on it, I'm not leaving a fingerprint. It's just sort of bouncing back just a little. Then I stuck my pick in it, it came out completely clean, so these are ready to go. If you're using rings like this, you want to cool them for a little while before you take them out. But any other pan, you can probably just tip it out onto a cooling rack and let them cool completely. When they're completely cool, you're going to wrap it really, really well in plastic wrap or tie it up in a plastic bag. And we're going to put this in the freezer, and we'll use that in future weeks. So don't eat this yet. We still have to finish it. Pop this into the freezer, and we'll come back to it in a couple weeks.